Hi, this is John Tillman. Joker, Rocket, and Deadpool with How It Should Have Ended, and you're listening to Triple Threat.
Hello, Internet, and welcome to Triple Threat, the music podcast with your host, Garrett Hicks and Tom Urrutia.
Hey, what's up, everyone?
We're here today to talk about one of my favorite Pink Floyd albums, so I'm pretty excited about this.
And which album is that?
That would be A Momentary Lapse of Reason.
Yay! If I don't sound enthusiastically, I told Garrett before we did this was going to be a fun conversation.
Yes.
And hopefully it'll be a fun conversation for you listeners to listen to, because this is honestly not one of my favorite albums.
Right.
So it's going to be interesting to see where we clash, but even where we have common ground.
Right.
And we're not joined by Becca. She couldn't make it, but we did talk to her to get some thoughts on the album, and we'll be sure to pop in with her thoughts every now and then.
Yeah, the reason we're talking about Momentary Lapse right now is because the Later Years box set is coming out later this year, 2019. Hopefully we're going to get this out on the day that it comes out, but we'll see.
Possibly even before.
Yeah.
Because this album plays a big part in the Later Years box set.
Right. Specifically that they'll be updating and remixing the entire album for the Later Years release. Hopefully they'll release that separately, but, they haven't said anything about that yet.
No, they haven't said anything. This is not like the early years where they said the set's going to come out in November, and then in March we're going to release things separately. It looks like everything is either together, or you get the sampler, the highlight disc, which will only have a few select tracks from the remix. So you're right. Hopefully this does come out separately, because if the remix is really good, then it'd be a shame to include it in this, $500 box set only.
Right.
Some of the things that they'll be remixing, we should say, they'll be kind of updating the drum sound, because this album was released in 1987, and
smack in the middle of the 80s.
Smack in the middle of the 80s, and oh boy, can you hear that it came out in the 80s.
Oh, jeez. All the gated reverb.
All the echoes.
All the drum machine.
Yeah. And so they'll be updating the drums to give it more of a crisp vibe. They use the word acoustic, I guess, to give the feeling of it's raw, it's not filtered.
Well, I think it's acoustic as opposed to electronic drums is what they want to get across.
That's that's a really good way to put it, actually. And they mentioned that Rick Wright, the keyboardist of Pink Floyd, will be featured more prominently because, well, we'll get to that.
Well, yeah, let's get into it right now.
Let's do it.
So we'll start off our little history before we get into the track-by-track review in 1985. So the year prior, David Gilmour and Roger Waters, the guitarist and bass player for Pink Floyd, respectively, had been touring their own solo albums. David had About Face, Roger had The Pros and Cons of Hitchhiking, and they weren't doing so well. Roger's reviews from that tour were basically, the critics were saying that he was trying to recreate Pink Floyd as a sort of cult of personality around himself.
Really?
Yeah. That, he was Pink Floyd and nothing else could possibly measure up. Meanwhile, David's tour is actually, the tour was doing so bad that he had to cancel a few gigs because they weren't selling tickets.
Ouch. I did not know this.
Yeah. And in 1985, Nick Mason was also kind of active, doing a couple things with Rick Fenn, who was the guitarist for 10cc. They released their album Profiles together to mediocre acclaim.
I guess to any acclaim.
And it kind of flew way under the radar. Like Identity, which came out in 1984 with Rick Wright and our good friend Dave Harris.
Shout out Dave. Go check out our interview with him. Great guy.
Yeah, he's fantastic. So in late 1985, Roger's like, okay, I have a decision to make. I'm either going to continue to record with Pink Floyd, because that's what the record company wants me to do, even though we haven't recorded together since 1983 doing the final cut, and Rick Wright is not technically part of the band.
Nope, he was out at that point.
Or I quit and try to go it alone. Either way could result in financial ruin. honestly.
Oh boy.
So, considering that he felt that Pink Floyd was a spent force, was very finished after the final cut, he decided to quit and properly get his solo career going. Earlier that year, David and Nick were kind of knocking around the idea of, well, maybe we should do something. Maybe we should get that Floyd album together. And once Roger quit and was told that we're going to carry on without you, just so you know, he very famously told them, well, you'll never fucking do it. Which had the opposite effect.
Oh, yes.
As you can imagine.
Yes.
It was a real kick in the pants. I'm like, we'll show you, you stupid jerk, sort of thing.
Pretty much.
From Nick and Roger and David. So they started recording. Roger started litigating. The whole time the album was in production, there was this sort of looming lawsuit over it. And Roger even came to visit the houseboat, the Astoria, where they were recording.
Oh, I did not know this.
Yeah, he came to visit and talk some legal stuff with them, like interrupting their sessions of recording.
Ouch.
The follow-up album without him. So that must have been tense.
Oh yeah.
So meanwhile, what's Rick up to? Well, sailing mostly.
A lot of sailing.
Yeah, and once he got wind that David and Nick were recording a new album, he was like, okay, I would be more than willing to come help and record this thing. But due to his the agreement that he signed in 1981 when he left the band, after he was the only one of the band to make money off the Wall Tour because he wasn't technically a member.
Yeah.
He was a session musician. Part of that agreement prevented him from actually rejoining the band. So he was technically brought on to Momentary Lapse of Reason as a session musician again. Mm-hmm. And that's why he only appears on about half of the tracks, and not very much anyway.
Yeah, it sounds like Becca wasn't going to contribute much because if anyone is a longtime listener of this show, Becca is the biggest Rick Wright fan in the world. And to make an album that Rick is essentially not on or only half on, she kind of is like, well, I don't really like it that anyway, or I'm not really going to give it much of a listen.
Sure.
And it can be tough when you have a musician who you really love and they go into a project and they want to do it 100%. But either due to legal constraints or their own band members telling them off, it's going to be not just hard for the musician, but hard as the listener once you know that. And then if you listen to it, you're like, oh yeah, Rick's there, but I can't really hear him. Maybe he's mixed down or he's not doing anything like phenomenal.
Yeah, it was a very fine line that the Floyd had to tread here because, again, legally, they had to make sure that Rick was not a major part of this album. In fact, this is the first album since Metal in 1971 to feature a photo of the band in the artwork. And
that's right.
Yeah,
I didn't think about that.
Yeah, and the photo of the band.
Oh, I love this. I love this.
Just Nick and David. In the original releases and reissues, they actually insert Rick through the whatever the 1990s or 80s equivalent of Photoshop is.
I love the reinstated picture so much because they totally want you to think, oh yeah, Rick's totally a part of this picture. He was totally at the same photo session as David and Nick, and we just like, no. Even
though it's like very clearly he has the camera's focused differently. He's sharper than the other two of them just a little bit. It's so dumb looking.
It is hilarious to look at. And other thing that on a bit of a hilarious note is Garrett and I have often talked about like how those conversations in '85 went down, considering that the band members had done nothing together since '82, '83.
Yeah, and
just talking to each other. So what have you been up to? And David, despite his tour not doing phenomenally or anything, he was out with Paul frickin' McCartney doing No More Lonely Nights on Broad Street, and then David did a couple of demos that obviously didn't come out at the time, but the two of them were working together. So you can imagine David's gonna be at least a little excited to say he's working with Paul frickin' McCartney,
right? As well as a few other he was producing a lot of albums at this point too.
Notably, well, it was a few years later, but the band, they had the big hit, Life in a Northern Town. What is their name?
Oh, I'm drawing a blank too.
I'm drawing a blank too, but he produced that, and that was a hit. But still, that was a couple years later. But yeah, David's getting into the role of producer at this point.
And so is Nick. Nick is doing a significant amount of production as well. But at the same time, Nick is also indulging in his love of motor cars. And interestingly, Nick and David were getting their pilot's licenses.
Yes.
They discovered that they liked flying planes and helicopters, so why not?
Exactly.
And Rick is over there sailing around and making an album that no one listened to, unfortunately.
Well, I mean, not just him. Nick made an album that no one really listened to.
Yeah.
David's tour didn't go so well. So you imagine they could come together and they're both doing the whole thing of...
We need money.
We need money. Things didn't work out. Kind of kicking the ground.
Yeah.
So you want to make an album together, and
Yeah.
you want to make money. I mean, make an album.
Make music.
But I love the line that you came up with, because in '83, when Gilmour put out his album About Face, here they come back 2 years later, and David is essentially almost preparing for a third album. In case things don't work out.
He totally was. The 1987 album they were making was essentially started life as his third solo album. So when Nick came a-calling, he was like, we could make this a Pink Floyd album, and people really like that Pink Floyd name. We would make a ton of money if we did this. Let's do it.
Yeah. And then David brings forward, some of the demos he's working with. So these are the demos for my new album. I mean, our new album.
Right. And he'd been getting some feedback also saying this shit does not sound a thing like Pink Floyd. So he's like, okay, we'll fix it. Don't worry, we'll fix it. Meanwhile, Nick is like, I haven't touched my drum kit in 3 years. I'm gonna go get sound effects. Okay, how's about that? David says, "Well, you got to do more than that." Okay, I'm gonna make some guide tracks for the drums on this drum machine that I have,
because this was the '80s after all.
Right. So he made guide tracks, and other drummers filled in on the drum parts. Notably Jim Keltner and also Carmine Appice, who is best known, I believe, for the Velvet Underground. And that pretty much brings us right up to speed, I believe.
Right, so...
Yes, Momentary Lapse of Reason was released in September 7th, 1987, and it went right to number 3 on the charts.
In the US or UK?
Yeah, both.
Okay.
On Billboard.
Well, I mean, in that respect, Nick Mason isn't wrong to say people like the name Pink Floyd.
Oh, for sure, for sure.
Shoots all the way to number 3. Wow.
Yeah, it was only beaten out by... number 2 was Whitesnake's debut album, their self-titled album, and number 1 at the time was Bad, Michael Jackson.
Well, I mean, anyone who puts anything out in the same year as Michael Jackson doesn't stand a chance.
True. But still, number 3 is nothing to sneeze at.
No, nothing to sneeze about at all. I'm honestly surprised it went that high.
Yeah. It was met with some pretty mixed reception when it came out. A lot of people at the time were praising its production, even though that's one of the things that has drawn a lot of ire recently. Primarily, the problem that people had with it was the lack of Roger Waters, specifically in the writings department. And especially Roger himself was saying that, David is such a third-rate lyricist, and it's just not the same. And I gotta admit, this album doesn't sound anything like the Final Cut, which was the album that came before it.
Well, with that album, of course, Roger Waters was really helming that project 100%. We jokingly, lovingly call it a Roger Waters solo album.
Oh, it is.
Featuring David, Nick, and Rick.
Yeah. Not Rick. Rick wasn't a part of that.
Oh, yeah, sorry. But essentially, Pink Floyd's name is kind of just, it's on the record.
Yeah.
And that's where... technically it's a Pink Floyd album.
Right, but
it really...
Is it though?
No.
Because on the sleeve it says The Final Cut by Roger Waters, music by Pink Floyd, and it's like,
that hurts. That is another one of, an album that's very maligned. In the case of Becca, a lack of Rick.
Yeah.
And for some people, it's like, Roger... We get it. You're a great songwriter. Yeah. But you know who else? Are also great songwriters? The freaking members of your band.
Yeah. Teamwork He makes the dream work.
and unless you're Roger Waters.
Yeah, right. Anyway, let's
yeah.
start going track by track for Momentary Lapse.
Sure.
We begin things with Signs of Life, which is kind of an overture. It was written by David and Bob Ezrin, who was returning from The Wall.
Mm-hmm.
He helped co-write The Trial and helped orchestrate The Wall.
Mm-hmm.
He's a big part of this album. What do you think of Signs of Life, Tom?
It's a nice introduction that doesn't really do much for me. Now,
Sure.
at the beginning when I said this is not one of my favorite Pink Floyd albums, when I re-listened to it, not just today, but leading up to this review, I was thinking, like, this is going to be the time I listen to this album that I'm really going to get it, that I'm really going to like it.
Uh-huh.
Because Garrett, he really likes this album.
Yeah, and I've made no bones about it. It's not one of the first albums I've listened to by Pink Floyd. So I came into it expecting, like, what everyone else says about the album is that, it sucks. It sounds like a bad Pink Floyd cover band.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I didn't hear that one.
Oh, man, that was one I read that I was like, ooh, I don't know if I want to hear this.
Right.
So I got it as a gift. I didn't even buy it myself. And I listened to it for the first time, and I was like, I don't get all of the criticism. I do and I don't. Because like I said, the production is very obvious. But at the same time, I think the craft that went into making the songs is truly admirable, and some of the lyrics and melodies on this album are just breathtaking, I think. I
do give Gilmour and Mason credit for essentially doing this album despite Roger Waters not wanting them to, the press saying, we gotta make this a Pink Floyd album when, David was getting ready for a third album. That's gonna make him go like, I mean, I really wanted to make a third album, but, I'm gonna make a Pink Floyd album. So I give them credit for, going through it, making it, putting it out, and even still to this day, well, I was about to say when David tours, but he doesn't anymore. But when he did tour, and even when Pink Floyd toured in the 90s, they would still put in Sorrow and Learning to Fly, when they could have easily just dismissed this whole album entirely.
Right, like they did with the final
cut. I was literally just going to say that.
Yeah.
They performed nothing from the final cut. They could have easily just been like, Momentary Lapse Of Reason, it was a thing that happened here. We're going to promote our new album instead.
Right, but no, they made sure to bring back some of the better hits from Lapse to perform live in the 90s, especially, and I liked how they retooled some of them. We'll talk about that a bit later when we mention the remixes. I really like Signs of Life. I think it's an atmospheric introduction to the album, starting with the sound effects of the boatkeeper for the Astoria just rowing on a little dinghy down the Thames. It has a sort of like horror movie kind of vibe with the synths coming in at the beginning.
Yeah, a little bit. I can see why you'd say that.
Yeah, and this is, in the middle of the 80s, so like slasher flicks are a huge thing. It does sound kind of like a slasher soundtrack from the 80s.
Now that you mention it, I can kind of picture, the idea of, some lonely couple being like lost in the woods or trying to make their way through some sort of creek or a river. Yeah. And then there's the synth sound of like something's coming for them.
Ooh, yeah.
I guess I can kind of picture that.
Yeah. And then there's parts like Nick is in there in a rare vocal cameo where he is reciting just this poem that nobody knows where it came from. It might have been original to this. And it's not really clear what he says because...
No. Every time I hear it, I just like, what's he saying?
It's something along the lines of, in the childlike world, the world went, I do not like to... ...
I would love if this were brought up in the remix a lot more to understand what he's saying. And two, when the remix comes out, and if that's more audible, people ask Nick, like, what does that mean? Like, did you get that from something? And Nick just goes... I don't know. I just made it up.
Right. I especially like toward the middle of the track. There's the synths just kick into overdrive, and you can tell this is definitely one of the tracks that Rick contributed to, with this sort of Bach-like progression leading into the guitar solo, which is actually like simultaneously my favorite and least favorite part of this track.
Really?
Yeah, because I really like. just the solo itself, the notes that it hits and everything. I just hate the way that the solo is produced. Because it sounds like super 80s sterile and brittle. Especially on the high notes. You know, where it just sort of pops way out of the sound.
I didn't really notice that too much. The first thing that I thought of, me being a musician, so he's playing in E minor, and he does this thing where he hits the bottom string, you know, this doom, and then scrape the top 3 strings, ba-da-ding, and I'm like, it's reminiscent of the beginning of Roundabout by Yes, and From the Beginning by Emerson, Lake and Palmer.
Right.
Just that doom, ba-da-ding.
Yeah.
But you're right, the way it's filtered is it doesn't sound like those because those 2 songs are on acoustic guitar, and this is obviously not an acoustic guitar that he's playing.
Yeah, it's an overly produced, super clean guitar. But I do like me some blues guitar soloing, and that's what David Gilmour does best.
Right.
So overall, I like this one. I think it's a solid beginning.
It's a nice introduction. What I was saying to earlier, where I was going into each listen saying, this is the time I'm really going to like this album. You know, I wasn't going into be like, and here we go, I'm going to really hate this album because everyone else hates it. No. I wasn't going to do that. I feel like it's easy to do that on albums that everyone just maligns and hates.
Sure.
I just wanted to just put it on and hear what I hear. And Signs of Life is like, it's nice to listen to. It doesn't do anything for me. It doesn't like psych me up and be like, oh my gosh, I want to hear the next track right away. Right. It's just like, it's a nice solid couple of minutes before the album like really starts for me.
Yeah.
Like honestly,
it's hard to call this one the opener when obviously Learning to Fly is the opener.
Yeah.
Right?
I mean, Signs of Life, you can't even call it a song. It's just, you know, it's just a few minutes of music, a prelude, so to speak, before the album kicks in. Funny enough, I did find out that Signs of Life, the title was briefly considered the album title. I don't know if you knew this.
Yes, I did. Along with one of the lines from Sorrow of Promises Broken. And another line that I think is definitely a Nick title would be Delusions of Maturity.
Well, I'm glad that they really didn't use a title.
I'm glad they didn't use any of those.
I mean, Signs of Life, I think someone told David, like, you shouldn't call it that because
that would infer that Pink Floyd was dead before this album,
right? Or imagine some really clever music writer would have said "Signs of Life," new album by Pink Floyd, is lifeless or something like that.
Sure,
they could have made a really easy pun, you know, not liking this album.
Yeah, in Nick's autobiography, he talks about finding the title for the album, and then he was like, anything we chosen, they could have made so much fun of it. So we tried to go for the one that would be the most obvious.
Oh, really?
A Momentary Lapse of Reason. I'm like, this was a dumb thing to do. Let's make an album without the guy who writes our albums.
Honestly, I thought they would just pick the title that would just give them the least amount of flack.
Yeah.
And that's probably what they had
I think
chosen.
they were trying to lean into it.
But also really glad they didn't title the album Broken Promises. That would have been kind of also obvious.
Yeah.
And one last thing I'll say about Signs of Life is, God bless David, but like he kind of cites Momentary Lapse of Reason, the whole album, as it's a concept album because it flows like a river, it sounds like a river. No, David, no.
I read that quote from in that interview. It seemed like he was like he'd just come up with that idea. It's a stretch.
It is totally a stretch. It's like you can't say the album is a river just because it has a river to begin it.
Yeah,
it doesn't work like that.
Sorrow has a lot of river imagery.
Well,
there's a decent amount of water imagery throughout the album, but I would not call it thematic.
No, even it sounds like you're stretching right now just to get that. So
sure.
Glad they didn't call it Signs of Life, but a nice introduction. Listen to the album. That kind of doesn't do much for me. I'm just kind of waiting for the album to start.
Sure. So let's start then.
Yes, pretty much.
Let's actually start. Learning to Fly, the first single from the album, and definitely it's the one that you hear on radio.
Yeah.
So I'm surprised that I ever hear this on the radio.
I have never had on the radio, but I don't doubt that they play it.
Yeah, I've heard it a couple times.
This is kind of the one that you can say this would be the quote-unquote hit single.
For sure.
It has the, I guess, most memorable melody, and it would have fit perfectly as a single at the time with the big voice choruses. That was a big thing in the 80s.
Yep.
And of course you open with just big drum sounds like you would in the 80s.
Yeah, very nice percussive intro. Speaking of percussion, Nick, in his autobiography, he felt
I can see that. That's probably why this is probably my favorite song on the album.
Okay.
It's the one that I listen to and I'm kind of like, there's Pink Floyd. These are the guys that I love. And also it helps because this song has been featured on Echoes, The Best of Pink Floyd, and A Foot in the Door, Best of Pink Floyd.
Yeah.
Because this is the track, probably from the whole album, that Nick is right, does sound like the most like them. And when you put it on as the first track, at the time you could listen to it and, really start to get into it. And then what happens next is up to you, how you feel about it.
Yeah. So, Learning to Fly was written by David, by the lyric writer that he brought in as a sort of teammate, because he was also feeling very nervous about writing lyrics, and apparently for good reason, based on what people were saying about this album. Anthony Moore was his partner in question. Some of the arrangement was helped by Bob Ezrin, and part of the chord progression was composed by John Caren, who would later join Pink Floyd for the tour of this album as well as the following one. And he's also one of the only musicians to ever play for both David Gilmour and Roger Waters on their solo tours.
That's right, I didn't think about that.
Yeah, he's one of the very few people who've crossed over. Him and I think Graham Broad, who's played drums for both of them.
Has Guy Pratt never played with Roger Waters?
No, he hasn't.
Oh, he should. Because he's a good bass player, and he would show Roger what's up.
No, I don't think they would get along.
No, they would not.
Like, it's hard to imagine Guy Pratt not getting along with anyone, but
right, because Guy Pratt is the most happy. He's the happiest guy to ever be a musician, ever.
Yeah.
And you get him next to grumpy Roger Waters, and Roger would look at him like, "What are you doing?
Yeah.
This is my show, not ours."
I really like Learning to Fly too. I especially appreciate the lyrics on this one. That's what grabbed me immediately. I find them very evocative, very image heavy. It actually feels like whenever I'm singing it that I'm soaring a little bit. And the vocal itself, it's so strange that you have such evocative emotional imagery, but the vocal itself has zero emotion to it, especially in live versions. But it seems very detached, and I've heard versions of it with a singer who's trying to get more invested with the lyrics, but it just doesn't work as well.
So you think it kind of works with the delivery that's on the record, even if it's not the best delivery? I guess
not the best. I think it is the best delivery for it. It has to have zero emotion to it.
Okay.
It's weird how that has to be the case, but David figured out exactly what needed to be done with that, and I applaud him for it. This is another song that Rick is for sure present. You can hear his synths, and he's also part of the backing vocals. You mentioned the big choruses. He's in there. The bridge is another high point, I think, with these sort of tumbling drums. And you can hear Nick Mason in another vocal cameo. That's 2 in a row.
Yeah.
Where this is actually from his flight lessons, where he's checking in with his instructor over the intercom.
And that's something else that I like about this song is the double meaning. You can look at it face value and say it is a song about learning to fly. Heck, you've got Nick Mason learning to fly right then and there.
Yeah.
But I like the double meaning of this track, especially with Gilmour singing and writing, because he is learning to be the leader. He's being the one to take flight and bring everyone with him. Yeah. That's something that I've always kind of liked about this track, even kind of without really knowing the history. I don't know why. I've always just liked that double meaning of learning to fly literally, and even if you don't know the history of Floyd, how we as people learn to fly and take initiative in whatever it is that we do.
Yeah.
I've always liked that, and it's kind of almost ironic, I guess, that David's learning to fly, and yet this song has 4 writers on it.
Yeah, baby steps, right?
Baby steps. Because one thing that that I noticed when going through these songs is that a majority of this album is co-written.
Yes,
and you can tell he's getting, like you said, his baby steps, and him feeling not sure about a writer as him being a writer. But imagine if he's being the leader of Pink Floyd. There's going to be a lot of freaking pressure on him.
Right. And
he's probably saying, like, guys, I need help, please.
Yeah, and I think that's something that he's always had to deal with. He relied on a couple of covers and co-writes on his first solo album. On About Face, he worked with Pete Townsend on a couple of them, although most of the songs are written entirely by David on About Face. Mm-hmm. And then even after Momentary Lapse of Reason, he's bringing in Polly Sampson, his girlfriend, later wife, to help him with The Vision Bell and On an Island and on Rattle That Lock. Lyrics are not his forte, and it's very apparent that he is aware of that.
I really do like the double meaning of this song.
Yeah, me too.
Learning to fly, literally and personally.
Yeah.
I've also tossed this out there before, and I'll toss it out right now. If anyone else in the chorus, especially on the melody lines, can't keep my eyes from the circling sky, has anyone else thought of Circle of Life from Lion King? Just putting that out there.
Oh my God, you're right. Oh, it does sound like, whoa, all right.
I think I've pointed that out before, so I'm putting that out. If anyone else thinks that, let me know. I don't want to be the only one who thinks that.
My mind has been blown a little bit. But yeah, you combine this song with everything we've mentioned. And as well as I liked something I read that called the guitar riff on here sounds kind of like a buzzsaw. And I thought, that's great. I love that description. And especially like when it breaks down in the third verse, and it's just, it really does feel like you're kind of floating above the clouds. As listening to that, I've given this song a lot of praise, and it deserves that. I have to admit, though, the studio version is like my least favorite version of this song.
Really?
Yeah, because in every live version that followed, which is I guess would be just 2.
2, yes.
Yeah, and both of the live versions that followed on Delicate Sound of Thunder and on Pulse improves on a lot of things. Mainly that the live versions are faster. Just a hair faster on the tempo, I think, really lends it, really helps the song feel like it's more in motion.
That's right. David's never really performed this one solo.
No, and I think the reason for that is how kind of uncomfortable he thinks the album sounds production wise. He's said that he doesn't like performing anything he did from About Face or Momentary Lapse because it sounds dated in the 80s.
Yeah. I mean, he's not entirely wrong.
That said, the Pulse version is significantly different in its arrangement in that it relies a lot more on guitars than on synthesizers, which I think is, first off, just it sounds a lot better generally, but also I think it's kind of a clue as to the direction that the remixes are going to take for the updated version coming out later this year.
Right.
That we're going to be moving away from the overproduction, put a lot more emphasis on the guitars and probably organs and stuff from Rick, as well as the drum tracks.
Right. Because it sounds like Rick recorded a lot more than what we hear on the album. Right. And this is one that I legitimately don't know what they're going to do, so I'll be curious to see what it sounds like when it comes out. Because I like it the way it is. Also, fun fact, this is one of the few Pink Floyd music videos that they're actually in.
Yes. Yes, it is.
So for those who are like, Pink Floyd never shows their face, this is like the one exception.
Yeah, basically.
Because in between, the artsy stuff of, the guy in the field and on top of the cliffs, interspliced with that is some, performance footage of Pink Floyd and the band. You see David Gilmour in his 80s hair and his 80s look. Yeah. And so you watch it and you think, oh yeah, there they are. Yeah. It's almost bizarre to watch it and be like, oh yeah, they actually have a face.
Right. Right.
And there's another video, maybe we'll link in the description if Garrett knows where to find it. He's talking about this where, David, being quote unquote uncomfortable, just starts flying. No, not flying. Just putting his arms out like
Right.
he is flying.
During the third verse breakdown, where he doesn't have anything to play, on the Delicate Sound of Thunder one, he just waves. But there was another concert that was filmed for possible release, but they didn't like how it turned out, where he like just stretches his arms out like wings, and I'm like, I'm flying, yeah. And it's like, David, you can't.
I call that David Gilmour's Mike Love moment, because
Yeah.
Mike Love, since he doesn't play anything in the Beach Boys, he's the lead singer. Oftentimes he will, do essentially like hand motions or things like that you watch it and you're like, that's so bad.
Oh, that's cheesy.
I know, exactly.
Yeah.
So,
but one last thing to say about the live versions of the album. They also, the studio version is the only time that you hear David playing the solos on Learning to Fly. Because in the live versions, he always tossed those solos off to his rhythm guitarist, Tim Renwick, to do. And I think Tim just knocks it out of the park, both versions, with like faster, more expressive solos than the one featured here. And that's all we're going to say about Learning to Fly, right?
yeah, I feel like
we've dug this one into the ground.
we've done, let's go to other tracks, because there are other tracks in this album.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Next is Dogs of War, or The Dogs of War, depending on which release you're looking at. Written by David Gilmour and Anthony Moore. This is a sort of 80s version of a 12-bar blues that has like these really ominous string synths. Just keeps the song chugging along. A lot of growling, to imitate dogs. This song was inspired by someone left a sample looping of someone laughing, and David's like, "Oh, that sounds like a dog, like a dog." Hold on, I'm gonna write something.
Do you know where they got the title from?
Yeah, it's from Shakespeare.
Yes, Julius Caesar, to be more specific.
Cry Havoc.
Cry Havoc and Let's Slit the Dogs of War.
Yeah. It's kind of it's a weird anti-war song, and anti like the things that lead up to war. It mentions a lot of like businessmen and that sort of thing, politicians and so on, going after their own ventures. What do you think of Dogs of War, Tom?
This is often regarded as one of, if not Pink Floyd's worst song in their entire catalog. And
yeah, there is definitely one poll that put it at the bottom of the list.
And honestly, I think it's okay. Like, when I play it, I don't go, ugh. Like, no.
Right.
I'm just kind of like, this is David doing his thing. Who am I to judge? Who am I to argue? I have nothing against him wanting to, talk about war. It does come off as kind of awkward, because that was never really something that he talked about. That was definitely more Roger's territory, considering that his own father died in the war, and that's something that's always has stuck with Roger in the works that he has put out. So it does feel kind of awkward, so this is really his first time doing it. So I kind of like, I take it as it is, and I'm like, this is David saying about war. I don't like war either. But this song is not the worst thing I've ever heard. Right. So it's just okay.
Yeah. I really like it. I especially think that, man, the vocals on this from David are especially fierce. Like,
you can't deny that.
Yeah.
You can. He's really giving it here.
Oh yeah. You got some great organ slides that lead into the lyrics. As well as I especially like once the drums kick in after the excellent saxophone solo from the man in the mullet himself, Scotty Page.
Is it just me, or does the sax solo change the song? I mean, at that point, they changed the rhythm of it a little bit.
Yeah,
it definitely slips more into a 6/8 waltz, as opposed to just this slow dun 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 dun. It's dun 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 when the sax solo kicks in. When the sax solo ends, we go right back into the structure of the normal structure of the song, and I'm just I don't hate it or anything. It's just kind of like, all right, that was a sax solo. It happened.
Yeah.
This song is just honestly kind of meh for me. It's okay.
Yeah, I feel like it might be trying a little bit too hard to be Money.
Maybe. I mean, but Money's just more rhythmically more interesting.
Right. Yeah, like I was saying, my favorite part is when the drums are in and you got that third verse that has just some tasty guitar licks just thrown on top, and just like, oh, so nice. And again, though, the only thing I have to decry in this is production. You got big gated reverb drums. You got, the sax sometimes sounds a little bit too bright,
A little too shiny.
yeah. And
maybe they could have gone for a dirtier sounding sax.
Right, something with more growl to it, like they did in Dark Side of the Moon.
Because the sax playing is really great on this track.
Yeah, super impressive, especially how Scotty actually growls into the horn a little bit, and you can hear that on the record.
But it does change the song, not just rhythmically, but it's like, wow, really shiny sax playing on a pretty dirty song.
Yeah,
doesn't quite fit.
Yeah, it just feels like everything in here is a little too clean, a little too sterile, and yes, I feel I've been saying that a lot, but that's generally the feel of this album.
The guitar solo is, in my opinion, buried underneath the backing vocals in this track. Sure. Because, as you mentioned, there is quite a bit going on in this song, and the backing vocals, along with the echo and the reverb and the drums, they sound big. It was the 80s. I feel like I'm going to keep saying it was the 80s a lot in this review, because it was the freaking 80s. But anyway, there's this guitar solo, and you can't hear it, but it's just buried. Yeah. And I want in the remix for them to turn that up. I want to hear that.
Yeah, or rather, probably just turn everything around it down or off. It is funny you mentioned the mixing on this sounding a little too like there's too much going on. This is actually a very sparse remix compared to the original mix of the album that nobody has ever heard. Because in Nick's autobiography, Inside Out, he talks about how they recorded a lot of things to go onto every track. Okay. And then in the initial mix, everything was on there, and he was like, "This is sensory overload. Wow. We have to remove some tracks. We have to turn a lot of things down." And he said the result had a lot more air, a lot more space to breathe. I'm like, this does?
This is air?
Yeah.
This is mud.
So I think we're going to get even more of that air coming up on the remix, especially. And that quote also makes me think that maybe Rick played on more things than we realize, and they just had to take him off for sound's sake as well as legality.
Yeah, I would think, honestly, it's more legality, because if you put Rick on every single track on this album, then you might as well say he's a member, but you have to say, well he's not. Legally, technically he's not, but we as fans are going, yeah, but come on.
Right. That's what this remix is for. And one more thing that makes the live version just stand out a little more, other than being live and having that, just naturally having a little more grit from being played off of the other musicians, and at the same time, there's a duel between the saxophone and the guitar on the live version, and it's a nice little moment. Anyway, moving on to the fourth track, One Slip, written by David Gilmour and someone he would collaborate with more in the future, Phil Manzanera, known for being the guitarist from Roxy Music. What do you think of One Slip, Tom?
It's another one of my favorites on the album, actually.
Okay.
This is the one track as of this recording where the remix has already been released. Yes. This has been like a preview track of the remix. And I'll talk more about what I really like in the remix. But this is kind of simply another one of my favorites on the albums, and I was very happy to see that it was the first preview of the remixed album. Right. I like the way that Dogs of War kind of segues into it. I like those rototoms. I think that's really nice. Yeah. But I'm gonna switch it back around and say I would cut the first 36 seconds of this track, where you get all the beep 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 noise, because then 36 seconds in it just starts. It's like that's where the song should start. The first 30 seconds is kind of like, is the song starting? Oh, now it started. Right. I kind of would just cut that, because it just it sounds like this song should just start 36 seconds in, and when they released it as the single B-side of Learning to Fly, that's where it starts. Yeah. It starts with and then the song actually starts. So the first 36 seconds are kind of like the song hasn't started yet.
Yeah. I know what you mean. I definitely would also say that maybe these blips and bleeps aren't necessary to the proceedings here, especially because it also kind of smacks of you remember Time? Time is nice. Yeah. With that sort of...
I didn't think about that. I like that, actually.
That was, I think, the third time I listened to it, it was like, wait a second, they're trying to do Time again.
Rototoms and sound effects. Yeah. just like time, or it's the idea of like,
or like
hey,
a fax machine or something.
fax machine, or I'm gonna bring that quote again. It's the '80s. What sounds can we make in the '80s? We can make bleeps and bloops and burps and farts.
Yeah, basically.
And it's just like, guys, just because you can doesn't mean you should. You know what? Take the 36 seconds out, and the track just flows a bit nicer.
Right. I would agree with you. I do think that the beginning goes on a little long.
Mm-hmm.
But then the main song kicks in.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned the rototoms. I really do like this sort of backbeat that supports the whole thing.
Mm-hmm.
And once the lyrics come in, you got a really muscular guitar that comes in behind the sort of blippy main riff. It goes together, I think. And then, of course, I really like the lyrics. I really like the melody line. This is definitely one that stood out to me the first time I listened to it. I was like, oh, I can really get behind this song on this album. I'd heard "Learning to Fly" before, but this was probably the one that grabbed me immediately on first listen.
Yeah, after "Learning to Fly," which is my first favorite song on the album, this is definitely my second favorite. And you did mention the guitars kind of weaving in and out of the main riff and the rototones, and even playing in between the different vocal lines. I have no idea why no one else besides me, and even telling you, has made the comparison between this track and "Give Blood" by Pete Townsend.
Yeah,
because David plays on that. I don't think David co-wrote that one. I think
he didn't write, but he did help. He plays on it.
Yes, and he's playing these kind of the same guitar bits in between. Like there's a bit where he plays like dun 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 dun, like in between some vocal lines on this track that are totally sounds like they're taken straight from "Give Blood."
Yeah,
and it's that kind of fast playing with the pedal that David loves to do.
Yeah, and it's very much the "Another Brick in the Wall" or "Run Like Hell" or "Take It Back." Yeah.
So I have no idea why no one else has made this comparison.
Probably because there's so many songs that he's written that have that kind of playing on it.
Right, but this one sounds the most like "Give Blood"
for sure.
I really like the sound of it. I like the melody of it. Mm-hmm. I like singing the lyrics, even if I don't know what the lyrics mean.
Yeah, to me they speak a lot of like inevitability. Like a lot of it feels like standing on the edge of a precipice. Like you're gonna fall, but it's just that feeling before you fall. That's what I feel like this song is entirely about. And I really enjoy everything about this song. Even Tony Levin coming in on the Chapman stick.
Yes. I do really like that this is a bass spotlight for Tony Levin, because when he's playing the bass, the rest of the band, they're not doing much, so he can fill in the space with the bass. That rhymes. And I really love his playing. I primarily known him from playing with people like Peter Gabriel.
Right.
And so to hear him play this and then look in the credits, see that's him, I'm like, oh yeah, that sounds like Tony Levin playing. And he's a great bass player.
Yeah, he is. But at the same time, like, this is a great Chapman stick solo. It's fantastic. It's what you expect Tony Levin to do, but I definitely think that, again, live versions kick it out of the water. Especially with Guy Pratt coming in playing his slap bass guitar solo, and it's just, whoa, oh.
Do you just have like a playlist called Momentary Lapse of Reason Live?
I did, actually. I totally did. Because they played every song of this live, unlike The Division Bell or some other albums. They played every song of this live, so you get a lot of different variation, and I feel like that's something that the album deserves, and what sets it apart from being not a Pink Floyd album,
And we should, speaking of remix, we should talk about this remix that just came out.
You know what? Sure, why not?
Yeah, I mean, they said in the press release the two biggest things they were going to focus on were making Nick's drums more acoustic. I'm just going to keep using that word.
Sure.
And bringing Rick's keyboards either to the front if they are in the mix, or completely out of the shadows if they were buried.
So the interesting thing about the One Slip remix, I was doing some reading up on this one. Rick is not present on the original studio version at all.
He's not.
So I guess that he never played on any version of it. So instead, what they did, they have a lot of sources of Pink Floyd playing this song live. They've got the Calhoun tapes. They've got two performances from Delicate Sound of Thunder to choose from. They flew in his organ track from a live performance on the remix.
I did not know this.
Yeah, and it's gorgeous.
Yes, we were talking to Becca prior to recording, and she loves the remix because she's a big fan of Rick Wright's swooshes, as I think we all are.
Oh, yeah.
And so to hear them, once they go into the chorus, it just really adds something. It really almost makes the chorus levitate.
Mm-hmm.
And I really like that. And I did not know that. I honestly just would have thought Rick played on this originally, and he was just cut out entirely.
No.
But that's cool. I'm not one to say I don't like it when they take something from another source and put in something else. If they make it work, then I don't really care because it still just sounds great.
Yeah, and we can't leave out Nick's new drum track.
No, they sound much more.
They sound more live. Honestly,
yeah, they don't sound dated. That's what I was trying to say.
Yeah, there's a little more timeless of a sound with the snare doesn't have that gated reverb on it. Mm-hmm. It's a really nice sounding snare. Honestly, yeah. I know that's a weird thing to focus on, but when you get a really good snare drum part, like I think of the one from "Try Not to Cry" by Paul McCartney. When you just get a really solid snare drum part, you want to incorporate that into the song as much as possible, and it really works.
Well, I did hone in on the snare on the remix, so much so that I went back and played the original after hearing the remix, and I was like, was it me like just noticing these drums now? Have they always sounded this way? And then you go back in the original mix, and it's got reverb, it's got echo, and this remix pulls that all back, and it was great. I was really happy to hear this as the first preview of the remix, and hopefully this is a sign of what's to come, hearing things like Rick's keyboards that we've never straight up heard before. You can bring things to the front, you can pull things back, but to
fly in new material from Nick and Rick, that makes it really special.
I totally agree.
Definitely warms up the sound. It sounds a lot less digital, a lot less brittle, and just breathes new life into it. Mm-hmm. I've been listening to Momentary Lapse of Reason for 10 years now, and this version of One Slip has immediately eclipsed the original for me. It's like, oh dude, the rest of this album is gonna sound bitchin'. I'm excited. I'm
very excited too.
All right, so enough gushing about the remix. Let's get back to the original badness.
Yeah. Whoa.
Oh no, I'm kidding. Track number 5 is "On the Turning Away," written by David and Anthony Moore. Yes, Rick is on this track.
That's one thing, is Rick's finally here.
Yeah. He the main thing he did was record some of the keyboards, but primarily was the backing vocals on this. Mm-hmm. He also recorded a solo for this song.
Yes.
Which was discarded not because it was bad, because they just felt it didn't fit.
Please bring that back for the remix.
I don't know. If they felt it didn't fit, then I don't think we're going to hear it.
But I want to hear it.
I know.
I know.
I know. I do too. Maybe they'll throw it in as a bonus somewhere else, but
just do what they did with "Wish You Were Here" with Stefan Grappaldi. It doesn't fit, but at least we can hear it, and we can hear it and say, "Yeah, it doesn't fit."
Yeah, that, or also like the live version feature a sort of keyboard spotlight before the main song kicks in, like it does in the original. That maybe they'll just add that as well, or instead we'll see. Mm-hmm. So "On the Turning Away" is kind of this folky Celtic-ish power ballad.
Yeah, that's exactly what I call Pink Floyd's power ballad.
Yeah. Starts off really nice, I think, with just David's vocals over a pad. Before all of the production kicks in.
Pretty much.
You got a plaintive sort of acoustic guitar that comes in, and it builds nicely, but it builds to a product that is just overwhelming.
You say overwhelming. One could argue it's even underwhelming because very simple chords. Nothing that any folk singer couldn't write with just 4 chords, 5 chords. And it doesn't really do much for me, to be honest.
Yeah. And the lyrics are kind of trite in a way. You know what I mean?
I didn't really care for the lyrics.
Right.
They're just things that occupy space.
Right. It's just, people need help sometimes, and we should help them by giving our help.
Because they need help.
Yeah.
Because help is important, and help needs help.
And it's helpful. What the f*** are we doing? How you doing, outtakes?
Oh no! This is totally going.
Oh, come on.
At least some of this is, because this is kind of what this song is. It's just so generic. We need to point out this song is generic.
It's very much Pink Floyd's like "We Are the World" or something.
Yeah, or it's like if you're gonna tell us that to give help, could you be more specific?
Right.
Could you tell us? Could you
Don't
give us examples?
turn away from the weak and the weary. Like, all right.
Well, yeah, we already know that.
You want me to throw a $5 to the homeless dude on the side of the road? I mean, I will.
Yeah.
Sure. No, but I don't know. I like the song. It's fine.
It's fine.
It's probably
but I don't really like it that much because it's fine. I don't hate it, but it's fine.
And if I had to rank all 11 or so of the songs on this album, it would go toward the bottom.
The epic voiced verses in this track kind of remind me that this whole album sounds different.
Yeah.
But I'm not sure if that's a good thing. Because granted, this was the first album they released in 5 years, and just with Pink Floyd's name, and this was of the time. A lot of records in the 80s probably sounded great at the time. We look back and we're like, oh, the 80s.
Yeah.
And this album is honestly no exception.
Yeah.
And that's kind of painful because we always thought Pink Floyd, they always knew how to craft brilliant sounded albums.
Yeah.
And maybe at the time when they put this out, it's like, this was the new sound. This was brilliant. We're embracing the new sound. We're Pink Floyd. And now you look back and it is dated.
Yeah.
Like, I'm a Pink Floyd fan, but you can tell I am not being shy about the fact that this album is released in 87.
Yeah,
definitely. And the epic voice choruses in this track particularly remind me like, yep, there's the 80s sound.
Yeah, yeah.
I don't know why it bugs me in this track and not others, but in this track it just really reminds me like, hey, 1987.
Yeah. And I do think, though, that they kind of realized that in the live performances of this song, because you might remember that they're significantly different in one part. In the third verse, right after the sort of breakdown where it's just sort of a bass, not solo but spotlight moment, and then the third verse starts. On the studio version, they just kick it right back into full gear. The live version, they let that verse sit on its own and be acoustic. And I feel that it's much more powerful that way. Like, you actually start to believe in the lyrics a little bit.
Only a little bit.
Only a little. It doesn't, like, grab you by the collar and say, pay attention to me. Yeah. It says, here's our case. You know?
I feel like the way you say that now, this song would really just work if it was maybe just a simple acoustic ballad,
right,
as opposed to a power ballad.
Yeah.
Because if it's an acoustic ballad, it gives the idea of it's just Gilmour and his guitars saying, help people out, and a gentle message like that will make us go like, he's right. We should help. But if it's a power ballad, help people, doesn't work.
Yeah, I would really like to hear, and it probably exists somewhere. I'd really like to hear an acoustic cover of this song. I think it would really serve itself to that. Do you want to take a break between sides?
Sure.
Okay.
Sure. Let's take a break.
All right. So tune in a minute, and we'll continue with side 2 of Momentary Lapse of Reason.
Hey guys, it's Tom from Triple Threat. Thank you so much for listening to part 1 of our review of A Momentary Lapse of Reason by Pink Floyd in preparation for the later years box set. Let us know what you think of the album, favorite songs, least favorite songs, and if you've gotten the box set, what you think of it. Stay tuned for part 2 coming very soon. Until then, happy holidays, and we'll see you guys next time. Bye-bye.